Greetings, citizen. Welcome to the show, and thank you for listening. For more of the art of wargaming in your life, definitely check us out on Instagram and Facebook. If you'd like to support the show, we have a Patreon account where you can do just that for as little as $1 a month. What we can offer will expand as the show does. If you don't have extra funds but would still like to help us out, you can give us a like, share, or 5-star review wherever you listen to podcasts. Want to get in touch? Feel free to message us or hit up our email, artofwargamingpodcast@gmail.com. We look forward to continuing the conversation with you because we know the world is vast, with many different ideas on tactics and strategy that can be applied to the games we enjoy.
You're listening to the Art of Wargaming on the Earworm Network.
On War.
Welcome to the Art of Wargaming on the Earworm Network. I am Yaga Malark. Hello, and welcome to the show. I know it's been a second since we posted an episode, but I've got some exciting news before we get into this episode where we begin our study of an offensive form of war. And that exciting news is the next episode is going to be on YouTube as well. So if you're somebody who, like me, learns a little bit better or focuses a little bit better with somebody to look at while they're talking, you'll have the opportunity to do so on our YouTube channel. It's just The Art of Wargaming. You'll recognize it immediately by the logos and whatnot. So I invite you, if that is your preferred medium, to join us over there. We also are now posting all of our episodes on YouTube directly from our RSS feed as well. So I'm very excited about that because this is something that's been in the works for a while. We've been working on how to kind of do it in a good way. And now that we've stabilized our production process a little bit more, we have the capability in order to bring you these videos. And like I said, so I'm very much looking forward in our next episode to also having some visual for it. So that's something to look forward to in the new year. But for now, defense. It's all very important. Everything we've covered up until now is something that needs to be kept in mind, no matter what form of war we are participating in. But now we are moving into the offensive. We're going to be going on the attack. And before we get into the episode proper, a couple of things. First off, the season went extremely well for Stygia here in Missoula, Montana. Our numbers have grown. Our attendance is better. The fighting has been clean and positive. It is everything you could possibly want out of a fighting community. So if you are a listener who is here in Missoula, who has not yet come out to a Bellegarth practice, I highly recommend doing so. During the winter, we are indoors. And in the summertime, we're outside in Bonner Park. So I encourage you to come and check it out. And if you're not in Missoula, to look up your local Bellegarth realm or similar and kind of see what's going on because, yeah, it's exciting. It's exciting. And this next year, I've already booked the plane tickets, so it is happening. I'm going to be going back to Beltane. If you remember the last time that I went there, I was able to get a lot of really interesting recordings with some very interesting people. And I hope to do the same in this particular year. I won't be going to Battle for the Ring here in January, but we will be down there at Beltane. So I am looking forward to doing that. That's in May, of course, but it's something, again, to look forward to. And so if you're in Tennessee and you haven't been to a Beltane, which is a Durdemarian event, I highly recommend it. They always put on a heck of a party, and I'll be there. So if you want to say hi, just let me know. Another thing I wanted to announce, and this is something that's still in the works, and so we don't have a permanent thing on it, but you may have heard me mention on this show something called the Great Hunt. And this is an organization within Bellegarth that is dedicated toward giving people a framework, a structure by which to advance their skills, by which to advance their understanding of their fighting and how they can improve. And it's also mixed in with quite a bit of lore. So if you're curious at all about what the Great Hunt is, you can go to geddon.org, that's geddon.org, and type in The Great Hunt. That's the Belagarth wiki. Or you could even just type in The Great Hunt Belagarth into Google, and it'll bring it right up. Like I said, there's some lore that's involved. It's got to be fun. It's got to be a little, got to have that substance to it. And the reason I bring it up right now is because we're going to be getting another podcast soon, one that is featuring the Great Hunt. And it is going to be somewhat lore-based, of course, and it will also be something that studies the trials and the merits and the other various aspects of the Great Hunt in greater detail. So if that's something that interests you, keep an eye out for the Miasma of the Dread Gods, because that is going to be what this other podcast will likely be called. So I'm looking forward to bringing that to you. I'll let you know when that's finally off the ground, so that if it is something that you're interested in, if it is, if you're a part of Belagarth, or you're part of a similar fighting organization that might want to incorporate some of these ideas, incorporate the hunt into what you do, well, you're welcome to do so. So that channel will be opening up soon, and I'll let you know about that. In this next episode, I will be talking a little bit more about the Votann and about the various goings-on in my personal wargaming career. It's confusing sometimes. We record episodes in order, of course, but we record them beforehand, and then I do the intros before they're about to come out. So sometimes it can get a little confusing as to what I've said where. But you'll probably hear in the next one, I'm playing Votann. It's going well. I've been having a heck of a losing streak recently, but sometimes that's how it goes. Even professional gamblers will tell you that occasionally the dice and the cards will just turn on you, and there's not a whole lot that can be done about it, except to keep trying, to keep playing, until the spell breaks. And in this particular case, you've also got skill involved. It's not just a luck game. It is also skill, and I'm learning this new army. So there's a little bit more involved to it here. I'm taking these losses as a lesson. I'm taking them as an ability to learn from kind of what's going on. You can learn a lot more from a loss than you can from a win. It's tedious. It can be frustrating at times, but if you keep with it, you'll eventually learn kind of what's going on. So I look forward to talking a little bit more about that with you. I haven't been in a tournament for a while. Still getting my army painted up, and we'll hopefully be able to showcase some of that for you when it's ready to go. I think I've yammered on for long enough at this point, and I'm excited to share with you this new chapter as we go on the offensive with Clausewitz and begin talking about offensive war. So up until this point, most of what we've been studying with Clausewitz has been on the defensive. And as we know, defensive doesn't mean static. Defensive doesn't mean not doing anything in return. During a defensive war, defensive campaign, there are still offensive actions that are taken. And so we've discussed them a little bit. But the reason offensive actions are taken in a defensive war are very different when you're the attacker. And so, again, while we've explored these concepts a little bit and we've, looked into them, we haven't fully covered the attack, the offensive, the mindset that we need to be in. That's what we're going to be getting into right now. Again, we've been in the defensive mindset, so I want you to still remember what we've been talking about, but realize that now we are talking about something different, a different headspace, a different goal, a different mindset. The first thing is, we've already discovered and said that defense is the more superior form of war. That being said, every defense has its weakness. Every defense has a sort of counterplay that one can do to overcome it. Even though defense as a general rule is stronger, defense itself always has some sort of weak point. And so as an attacker, we're looking for that always. There's a constant vigilance looking for that exploitable spot in our opponent. But also knowing that our opponent is not going to stay in a static state. Just because we have identified what sort of a defensive method that they are using doesn't mean they're going to continue using it, because any good defender is not going to be passive. They're still going to be making decisions. They're still going to be maneuvering as well. Now, granted that they wait in a state of expectation, as we have discussed before, and we are the ones with the initiative in this particular case, if you will, but it's still good to remember that we're not up against insurmountable odds, that going against a defensive position, even though we've been talking about how awesome defense is for the last several chapters, last many episodes, it doesn't mean that we're going against a static opponent. So making sure that we have that in mind, making sure that we are understanding that our opponent is making moves as well, they're not just staying still, is important as we're considering our attack. It's going to change our plan as we go through it. Because as we're doing things, an attack is not going to be fully completed without some action in return from the defender. If we are undergoing a campaign, if we have a goal in mind and we're moving towards it, that attack, even if it meets with resistance at first, it will need to be changed. There's that wonderful adage that every plan is perfect until it meets the enemy. And that is very much true when we're dealing with the attack, and we need to have that flexibility. But we also need to understand that during any attack phase, during any offensive war, we're going to need to have stages of rest and reassessment. When we're looking to our own soldiers, making sure that we're in order, making sure that we're well supplied, well rested, well fed, everybody's good to go. But we're also looking to make sure that our opponent is still doing what we thought they were doing, or if they're doing something different. And so we reassess our strategy constantly in every stage of an attacking an offense. We may be moving toward one thing, but things change. The nature of the battlefield changes. Our opponent might change and go a different direction than we assumed. The weather might change. There are many things that might alter what we're into there. So we have to remember that this reassessment phase is important, not just bulldozing straight toward the original goal, but understanding that our method of achieving that goal might change. And as we're moving forward, there's also the consideration of making sure that the space behind us is protected. That's not something a defender typically has to do as much, because they're going to be maneuvering in such a way that they have those secure interior lines most of the time. But for us, as we move through an area, well, that means that's an area where we can be struck. That's an area where we are now weak because we are no longer in there. This area is not covered by the attack itself and is in need of pickets and garrisons. And we're going to talk a little bit about the effect that this has on the overall force of the army here in a little bit. But just understanding that the space behind this attack has to be protected. And it's something that we're keeping in mind, because it's not just a matter of being attacked back there, but that's also where our line of retreat is. That's also where our line of communication is. And so without that space, without that ability to use it, we're in danger. So even when we're on the attack, we're still planning for the defense, because defense is a part of all of war. We want to make sure that we retain what we get. And the defense is the superior form. And so if we're moving between attack and defense, we're going to be using that superior form as well. Much like the defense uses offensive methods on occasion, we have to use defensive methods as the attacker as well. It's very important to make sure that we're doing that, because defense is superior. And so every attack leads to a defense, and every defense leads to an attack, because for us it's all about the positive motion, the positive action, moving towards our goal. We're not trying to prevent our opponent from getting a goal. We are the ones driving towards it. And so any defense has to have, at its very base, a means, a plan to follow through with some sort of attack, because otherwise, why are we there? So as we're going to end up with captured fortresses, most likely, if we're moving by them and if they're of any sort of target. Now, of course, this was back during Clausewitz's time. We may not get fortresses per se as we're going through, but it's still kind of interesting, because they're not the same utility for us as they are the defender. The defender is using them as a line to break us apart. If you recall in a previous episode, the idea of putting those forts in front of you as the defender, so that your opponent has to split their forces in some way to get around them, and you can deal with them in a more manageable fashion. But we're not going to have that as the attacker. We're moving past them. And so the fortresses are actually of far less utility to us than they would be for a defender. Now, they do give us a place to have a defensive garrison, for sure. It will give us a place to maybe have a magazine or some sort of depot, and it can be used to help secure our line of communication or our line of retreat. But in terms of that sheer utility, a defender definitely gets more use out of those fortresses than we do. Not to say that we shouldn't capture them, because if we don't, we have a defender in our back line, and as we discussed before, that's bad. So we're trying to make sure that we are consolidating, that there's nothing behind us. And so think about this in like a 40K sort of thing as well. As you're moving into terrain, the defender, the person who's moving back, has the advantage in that particular case, because the terrain is between you and the attacker. As the attacker, you need to move through the terrain to get to the defender. Now, once we do that, the terrain isn't as useful to us, because it's now behind us and isn't being used for any defensive thing as of that point. We might fall back and use it and take a break from our attack. But in terms of that sheer utility, our forward motion carries us past. And so even that terrain becomes less valuable to us because we are on the attack. Now, again, if we go on the defense for whatever reason, we can use it as an area to do so. So captured fortresses, captured terrain pieces in 40K, captured zones within something like Belagarth or any other fighting event, that is going to be the same case. And because we can't depend on the same thing that the defenders can. We can't depend on these fortresses being, well-stocked and ready to attack. We can't depend on popular uprisings to be on our side either. That was a defensive mechanism that we had discussed in a previous episode, the idea of a highly motivated population having some sort of uprising against an attacking force. We're not going to have that because they're the popular uprising and we're the attacking force. So we're not going to be able to get that particular bonus either, which is unfortunate, but it's the nature of the attack. It's one of the reasons we call the defense the superior form, because defense can take advantage of many more things than the attack can, as a general rule. Because one of the other things that is going on here is knowledge of the country. The defending army will almost always have far better knowledge of the country than the attacker does. And that's not just to say the exact features, like where the mountains are or the cities might be located or the best roads, but also just how to move in it. If you're a person who grew up in the mountains, where there's sparse, like for me, there are forests here, but they're lodgepoles, and so that means they're highly elevated. When it comes to scrub, when it comes to things that obscure vision, we don't have a whole lot of that here. In terms of, because our trees are spread out, we have large swaths of open land. It's a totally different place to fight than it would be in America's southeast, where you have far thicker vegetation to consider, and not as many mountains to be able to maneuver around or use as guideposts or anchors for a flank. And so the way that you fight in that zone is going to be very different. So it depends. It very much depends. And so as we're moving into our opponent's country, we can assume, rightly so, I think, that our opponent is going to have better knowledge of that country. And so as we're going into it, we need to get around that somehow. Whether it means hiring local guides, if you remember all the way back to Sun Tzu, he was talking about bribing locals in order to get information about where the opponent might be or the best ways to get through an area, which is highly advisable. There's the use of our own scouts, reconnaissance parties, going out and trying to find the best ways through, trying to, again, locate the enemy and maybe see what they're doing. Learn a little bit from them in this particular case. And then carefully going, not rushing into things, not being overly confident because we think we know what we're doing, because we're doing it the way that we knew. Just the other day, I was sitting down with a friend for this card game. I think it was called Duel. And the idea of it is that you're basically two samurai fighting, and it's a very, very, very elaborate version of rock, paper, scissors. But He was far better than me because he had way more practice, but I got him several times. I got him hung up because he was accustomed to fighting his roommates. And so when somebody new came in, somebody who fought completely differently, somebody with a different mindset and approach to the game, it took him a second to readjust to that because it was unfamiliar. How much more does this matter when we're moving an entire army into an unfamiliar place? Another thing that we do in the modern age is training specifically for that. We've got places here in the U.S. where soldiers go to try to get really into what is about to happen, like where they're about to go. And so while the United States was in Iraq and Afghanistan, there was a lot of training that was happening in the hotter, more desert forts. And you were sending a lot of the special forces and a lot of more elite forces to those areas so that they could train and be ready to go. We've got alpine training just in case, we go against an enemy that has that sort of terrain as well. You'll notice, I'm not sure when this episode is going to drop, but at the moment in the news, America is beginning to put its troops in Finland to protect that border a little bit from Russian incursion. And what's going to be happening there in part is that the Finns are going to be training American troops on how to navigate in that land, how to be soldiers in a place like that, because it's important. We can send soldiers in and say, all right, occupy this territory, but if the Russians or the Finns are far better at maneuvering the country, know their gear better, know the weather patterns better, they're automatically going to perform better as a result. And so for us, in the modern age, training is huge, making sure that we know the country that we're going to. Wargaming, I suppose you can do this a little bit in terms of like trying to figure out what your opponent is, like how they play and whatnot, but we don't get it on the same level as we do in real life on this one. So training, specified training to go in also helps. So in all of this, the thing that we are considering as the attacker is that we are, of course, trying to destroy our opponent's army. Both sides are trying to do that. The defender is likewise trying to destroy our army. But they do it by goading us into an area where we're going to defeat ourselves. They do it by different means. And for us, trying to defeat the enemy army also means intrinsically conquering territory. And so we have to have this in mind. Our goal then is to conquer that territory. If the enemy is there as well, that's incidental and obviously planned for if it's something that's expected. But forward motion, conquest of territory, needs to be one of those things that is at the forefront of our mind. And when we're talking about conquest of territory, we're not just talking about conquest of any old territory. Going after, that's there, so we're going to go after it. It's more targeted. Again, we have limited force, we have a limited time by which to complete our task. And so wasting it on taking absolutely everything on the opponent's side or the easiest thing offered is going to slow us down. And as we've talked about in previous episodes, time is on the side of the defender. And so making sure that we're moving through the best we can is important, and taking things that are important. So let's say a particular province is important. It's either a political place or it's a place where you've got a lot of industry or a lot of people. That is a good place to target, potentially. Resources are huge, going again after industrial areas or mines, farms, anything that can be used to supply us, but also take supply away from the enemy is extremely important. We had discussed fortresses, not necessarily for use, but for the purpose of our enemy not being able to use them. And of course, like I said, we can use fortresses to protect our line of communications and our line of retreat. So they're not useful. So you can see what I'm saying here, that these provinces, resources, fortresses, etc., are targeted. They're things that we want to gain. They're not just incidental. The enemy might be there, that's incidental. And hopefully they're there. Hopefully we can destroy them. But our actual aim is something targeted and something concerning territory. And once we achieve that, once we gain what we're after, a town, province, resources, whatever, at that point we then enter into a defensive part of the war. Not permanently, obviously, but there's a matter of making sure that we've shored it up. There's no point in taking something if we cannot keep it, because then that is a waste of resources, of men, of time, of logistics. Like, it's everything we do needs to be deliberate. Everything we do needs to have a purpose and economy of force. We're also looking for that overwhelming force as well, that eternal balance between the economy and overwhelming forces. But once we get something, we enter into hopefully a brief defensive period as we shore it up, make sure that it's not going to be taken from us, and then we can move into our next action. Because as we have seen, the offensive and the defensive flow into one another. One complements the other. We're never purely in one form for too terribly long. It's the exact opposite as what the defensive folks are doing, because they start in the defensive and they might use offensive actions to answer what we're doing as a reaction to what we're doing. But we're doing an attack. We're moving forward and then using a defense in order to preserve what we had, or to take a moment to regroup and move forward again, or anticipate our enemies, counterattack and try to deal with that. There's a lot of different things that make us as attackers go on the defensive, but they're all not. It's the exact opposite. It's the other method, the other mode as to what our opponent is doing. And so the attack, as we've said here, depends on positive action and positive force. And when we say positive, we mean we're actively moving toward the goal of our war, whether that's the enemy capital or whatever. We're moving eternally, because that's the only way that we win, is by using that force and by using those actions. But there are many things that decrease that force, that take away from what we have, because the force we start with is not going to be the force we end with. And that's for several reasons. I've got 7 here that Clausewitz provides. The first one is through the object of attack itself. The occupation of country takes away force. There is that motion in one direction. There is a concentration of that force. And so moving that force either forward from that place or to another place, that's going to decrease because we have just moved in. And so that's one of the reasons we take those defensive periods, is to build back our force, build back that power that we're going to be coming through. But through the object of the attack, through the occupation of that country, that will decrease our force. The second one is very much related to that, and that is through the necessity of the rear guard and the guarding of our line of communication and line of retreat. Obviously, we're going to be taking away from our forces to make sure that those things are safe, or at least can be preserved long enough for us to react to any sort of danger there. And so that bleeds away some of our force as well. And it's going to bleed away more and more and more as we move into our opponent's area. If we're right on the border, this bleed, this force reduction is not going to be as much. But if we've moved deep into our opponent's territory, then we also are dealing with a massive decrease of force if we're doing the right thing and reinforcing as we go. This part's important. And again, these decreases to force make sense. They're not something that, some of them are things that happen to us. But like these first two are things that we do, and then this is a necessary part of it, making sure that that force is decreased in order to protect what we have. Number 3 is something we don't necessarily have control over. Well, we do if we're not being stupid and we're trying to maintain good things, we do have control over this a little bit. But the third one is through death, is through the losses in action and sickness. That's still an issue now, but if you remember back to Clausewitz's day, sickness could level an army. Sickness leveled Clausewitz. And so making sure that we are watching for that and making sure that we are accounting for that. We don't want Pyrrhic victories where we've had a massive loss of force because we have a loss of personnel, and then we move on and we cannot win our next fight because of this decreased force. It needs to be taken into account. Whether these people are lost through action or sickness, and whether that could be either death or incapacitation. There's definitely sicknesses where it's like you're not dead, but you're not fighting either. And if you lose an arm or you lose a leg, you're far less capable in combat. And so these losses need to be accounted for as well. They're important. The fourth way that we decrease our force of attack is the distance of those supplies and reinforcements, because we're going to be in constant need of those things. Like we said in this last one, in number 3, losses are going to happen. Personnel losses are going to happen. Material losses are going to happen. And so that needs to be brought back. And the further our lines of communication are, the further our lines of supply are, the more that's going to take. the more force that that's going to take, and the more force that's going to bleed away from us because we're not able to replenish it as quickly. So that's also something that needs to be taken into account. This idea of distance and the amount of time that it takes for our people to be able to move forward again with the right amount of force. So that's going to be a decreasing factor as well. The fifth one is sieges and blockades. Anything that we're doing to choke our opponent off or keep them from acting or from getting supplies, that's also going to decrease our forces because we're dedicating our forces in order to do whatever that is. If our main force isn't, of course, engaged in the siege or blockade to begin with. That reaction, that need to take cities, that need to take fortresses that may be behind us and might be a threat, is definitely there. And so we're going to see a decrease in force based on that. The sixth one is the relaxation of efforts. If we decide to get sloppy, if we decide to get complacent, if we spread out a little bit too much, if we lose sight of our goal, if our aim becomes hazy, we're going to lose force. We're going to lose the ability to win. I've seen this happen in Belagarth tons of times, where you have one team that has really good early successes and has a numeric advantage over the opponent, but then people start just kind of slacking off. They're like, oh, we got this. And so they'll sit there and maybe have a conversation, not dedicate themselves as much to the attack. And if the defender is there and wily and good enough, I've seen comebacks happen simply because of this rule, simply because of number 6 alone, that relaxation of the attack, that cockiness, or even just the, well, we've got this. The complacency, the comfort, that's going to take away from that force of attack and might lead to our ultimate defeat. And then the seventh one is the secession of allies. If the people we're working with say, I don't want to do this anymore, for whatever reason, whether there's been too many losses on their side, or they've decided to switch sides, or they just don't want to be there no more. You know, that can be a huge issue. Obviously, that is a loss of force. To reiterate on this, force is how we win. That positive action, positive force is what we need as the attacker, and that is bled away from us. Every move we make, every step we take, we're losing force. And the ways that we do that, again, are 7, through the object of the attack, through the necessity of guarding what we've got, whether it's a line of communication, line of retreat, land. 3rd is through losses in action and or sickness. 4th is the distance that we get of supplies and reinforcements as we move deeper into enemy territory and extend those supply lines. The 5th one is through any necessary sieges or blockades that maybe were called for along the line of march. The 6th one is that relaxation of efforts, pride getting in the way, or sloth getting in the way. And then 7 is the cessation of allies. So we need to be mindful of all these things. We need to be mindful that they are big factors in determining what we are going to be capable of. And so that reassessment that we had talked about earlier in the episode, when we take an offensive action and then we take a period of time to rest and reassess what we have done, this is a good time to make sure that our force hasn't been decreased too much. Because if we're matched, if I've got a, let's say, power level, right? If I've got a power level of 3, and my opponent has a power level of 3, I lose. If they know what they're doing, I lose, because defense is superior. You need to be better. You need to have a higher amount of power, a higher amount of force to overcome that defense. And so we need to be mindful of these and try to mitigate them in whatever way we can. Whether that's having a relief army whose job is specifically to protect the objects of attack and do rear guard stuff and do sieges and blockades. Even though that is technically splitting our forces, we can have one that is specifically tasked for doing stuff like that. If we've got men and material ready to go so that we can replenish those losses and make sure that that supply is constant. You know, if we're looking for something and we haven't ordered it and it's way back there, it's going to take a second to get there. And if that's ammunition, if that's people, that stuff is needed. And so preempting that, especially as we move deeper into enemy territory, preempting those needs, preempting that necessity of maintaining those supply lines is a way to decrease the amount of decrease that happens to our force of attack. We can't control what our allies do, though. You know, we can't make them fight. If they're there for a reason, they're there for a reason. If they change their mind, they change their mind. But the best thing we can do is not relax our efforts. and make sure that we're continuing forward and maintaining that force with what we have, what we can control. And the success of our attack depends on this superiority of force. And that force takes many forms. It can be numeric in terms of people that we have on our side. It can be technological. It can be a moral factor. It can be a matter of fitness. There's a lot of things that go into this. There's a lot of things that contribute to superiority of force. And we want to have as many of those as possible because we know that it's going to be decreased ultimately. We do know that whatever we do, we're going to be looking at lack thereof. And so making sure that we're as full as we can be, with as many superiorities as we can be with this force, is important beforehand. We can't just do this willy-nilly. There's a lot of thought, there's a lot of planning that needs to go into any attack because it's risky. We're putting it out there. We're projecting ourselves. And if things go wrong, man, the stakes are really high. I mean, they're high for the defender too, but a defender can fall back and still maintain a lot of their advantages. If we have to fall back, if we have to secede territory or fortresses or towns, that's big. Because that's the way we win, is by acquiring. And so making sure that this positive motion can be done by that superiority, innate superiority, and as much as we possibly can, in as many fields as we possibly can. And this is all aimed at one culminating point. When we talk about economy of force and overwhelming force, those ideas combine in the idea of hitting one point super hard. At the beginning of the episode, we had talked about the fact that there are inherent weaknesses in every defense, that there are inherent flaws in any way of thinking. And if we have found a way to exploit that, if we have found a way to double down and move into it, that's huge. And so our attack needs to be made at that culminating point, at that weak spot that we have perceived. And if we've got the force to do so, if we've got the ability to just punch through there, then our attack is going to succeed. We're going to conquer territory while conquering our opponent. And that is perfect. That is what we are aiming for. But if we are weak for whatever reason, if that culminating point appears, or we know it's there, but we've been bled dry by trying to make sure that our rear is protected, and because we have suffered significant losses, our allies are gone and we're relaxed, that opportunity is going to come, and it's going to go. And if we approach it, we're not going to have the force to do with it. And so that defeats the economy of force, which is to say, don't waste it. If we don't have the force to do it, don't waste what we do have trying to do something that we cannot accomplish. So maintaining our force, maintaining our power is huge when we're coming to the attack, because it is the way that we do things, is by having that overwhelming force, that superior force by which we can overcome our opponent. So just to do a quick recap before we end for the day. Attack and defense, they're related. They move one into the other. We're not doing pure defense at any time, and that means we're not doing pure attack at any time. There has to be ways of resting. We have to find ways of making sure that we reassess and resupply and make sure that we're approaching things smart and with the proper force and the proper needs met. And we have to remember as well that the defense does not mean passive state. Our opponent is not just going to sit there and let us do what we want and get away with it. They're going to be actively trying to oppose us, actively trying to position themselves so that we have to act disadvantageously. We cannot underestimate our opponent. We simply cannot. And we have to expect that there's going to be some return action. We're not just going to be able to do what we want without any consequences. We're not just going to be able to follow through with our plan without anything happening on the defender's part, because again, they're actively trying to oppose us. They're actively trying to stop us from what we're doing. And so our stages of rest and reassessment are important there. And in doing so, we are able to make sure that our space behind us is protected. It's one of the things that is foremost on any attacker's mind, is making sure that what we take is what we keep. And so that means pickets, that means garrisons, that means troops that are left in the rear that cannot contribute later on. But it's important to do so. And every defense that we make, whether it's in the back there or it's our army having accomplished something and now just kind of sitting there taking a rest and recuperation moment, it has to still be a part of the overall attack. We have to have some plan to get out of that defensive posture and continue our attack. The defense is still important because defense is the superior form of warfare. It was true then, it's true now. Defense is the superior form of warfare if we've got the right force distribution. Again, if you're looking at something like Afghanistan, where you have a massive disparity in terms of numbers and training and gear, defense is not going to be as strong there, not in a direct sort of way. But as we've talked about before, the ability to use terrain, the ability to maneuver, that can actually be a form of defense too. It doesn't have to be a standing army going against them. You know, in terms of that overwhelming force, no, the Taliban or Al-Qaeda or whoever can't meet the U.S. Army in the field. They just can't. They'll get blown away. But in terms of using the land, using the people, using their techniques to have a defense, that's big. And so even now, defense is superior and needs to be recognized. And every attack that we have leads into a defense. And every defense we have has to lead into an attack. And we don't have the same rules when it comes to fortresses. As we move past those and the defender uses them for defense, we're only going to be using them as a simple utility, as a spot for our supplies to be safely given, or a place to store a few troops in the form of a garrison to oversee the country. But it's not going to be as useful to us as it is for the defender. Still good to take. We do need to take them, but they're not as useful. And as we're going forward, as we're trying to capture our territory, as we're trying to try to go after our opponent, we have to understand that the opponent knows the land way better than we do. Always, they're going to know the land better than we do. And so we have to account for that by using local guides, scouts, being careful, doing specific training for wherever we're going, and still understanding that the enemy will have the advantage there. And that is important to make sure that we note so we can plan for it appropriately. Of course, our ultimate goal is to destroy the enemy, but as the attacker, we do so by moving forward. We have to conquer territory, conquer ground in order to defeat our opponent as a general rule. And this isn't done randomly. This isn't a haphazard thing. We're going after specific things, whether it be a specific province, resources, fortresses, towns, whatever. But it needs to be something specific, and it needs to be a part of our plan, not just willy-nilly, not just taking it to take it, because as we've said before, we have to keep it, leaving troops behind in order to preserve what we have. So it needs to be thought out. It needs to be planned. But as soon as it's done, as soon as we accomplish whatever that is, that targeted thing, we enter into a defensive period again. Again, making sure that we can keep it, because there's no point in wasting the force in order to take something that we cannot keep. And we're moving, of course, moving and flowing between offensive and defensive. And we discussed how to maintain that positive action, that positive force, and what is going to detract from it. And the things that will detract from it, of course, are 7. Through the object of attack, by the occupation of that country, we're losing force. Through the necessity of rear guard and maintaining our line of communications and line of retreat, we're losing force. Through losses in action and sickness, of course, we're losing force. And then we've got that distance of supplies and reinforcements that takes away from us as well as we move into that territory, and we're bleeding things away. We're not able to replenish them as quickly. If we have to do any sieges or blockades going through, that's going to bleed force as well. If we decide to relax and just kind of take it easy, force is bleeding all over the place. Then, of course, if our allies decide to check out, suddenly we're missing that too. And so there's a lot of ways that we decrease our force of attack. And so that means that we got to shore ourselves up. We have to make sure that we have superiority in force. And whatever that force may be, we're talking moral, we're talking physical, we're talking technology, we're talking number of people, we're talking just esprit de corps. Any advantages that we can get, any superiorities we can get, and all of this force is aimed at a culminating point. It's aimed at a weakness, it's aimed at an opportunity. And so it is important that we maintain that force, that we maintain our fighting ability, because once that appears, it might not come back. Once we see a weakness, once we see an opportunity, we only have a limited amount of time to act. And remember, time is on the defender's side. And so being mindful, planning for these decreases of forces is a huge part of being a commander and moving forward. And I think that'll be it for today. I really am happy that we're moving into this new section. It's going to be really dynamic. I think defense is awesome. Defense is the superior form. But of course, all of us are super excited for the attack. So thank you for hanging on. thank you for being here and maintaining your faith in the show and moving forward, because we are. We're now going to be moving forward with positive action and making sure that we account for decreasing forces of attack. I'm not quite sure how that's going to happen while running a podcast, but it's got to at some point. So thank you all for being here, and we'll see you next time.
That's our show. Thank you so much for listening. If you haven't had enough of the art of wargaming in your life, you can find us on Facebook and Instagram, where I occasionally post funny and educational memes. If you want to get in touch with the show directly, you can email us at artofwargamingpodcast@gmail.com with any questions, comments, or concerns that you might have. Also be sure to check out all of our sister shows on the Earworm Network, including General Nerdery, Word Balloons, Fried Squirms, and more. We're working hard on having something for everyone. And again, you can find those at earworm.com. That's EARVVYRM. You can also find that in the show notes. But for now, this has been Yaga Malark, signing off.